Since 1976, with the help of an ecumenical committee, Geneva Campus Ministry has brought Christian scholars, artists, and professionals in a wide variety of fields to speak on campus. And I invite you right now to take note of the fact that on Tuesday, September 18, our next speaker will be Makoto Fujimura, the internationally acclaimed artist. So we're eager to welcome him from New York. I also want to thank those who make the Geneva Lecture Series possible, the supporters of Geneva Campus Ministry, contributors listed on the brochure, and in addition, the Congregational United Church of Christ and St. Raphael's Orthodox Church in Iowa City. Our format tonight is that our speaker will give her talk, then we'll take a couple of moments to gather some information from you, and then we'll have an open time of question and answer. Our speaker tonight has inhabited many different worlds, some for a short time and some for a lifetime. Ethnically, she is of Japanese descent, but was born in the United States. Culturally, she was raised in an Asian American home, but attended American schools. Professionally, she was a biomedical engineer in the Silicon Valley, but ended up being a leader in Christian ministry. Educationally, she has a bachelor's degree from Stanford University and received a master's in organizational leadership from her studies in South Africa. Geographically, she's lived mostly in the United States, but has traveled the world, speaking, serving, studying, networking. Economically, I got permission to say this, she's middle class. But she has lived among poor people in the slums of Nairobi, Cairo, and Bangkok. And if sorting all that out has not been enough of a challenge, religiously, our speaker has a lifelong commitment to one who was born to a particular people, in a particular time, in a particular place, with a particular culture, and a particular language. It claims to be the Lord and Savior of all the world. In seeking to define and identify herself, Nikki Toyama Szeto has found her voice and has become an important voice for Asian American Christians, a voice heard in many different places around the world. She's on the national staff of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and serves as the program director for Urbana, the well-known triennial missions conference that draws 20,000 students from 120 different countries every time it's held. She was also the co-editor and one of the writers of a book called More Than Serving Tea, Asian American Women on Expectations, Relationships, Leadership, and Faith. Nikki lives in Madison, Wisconsin with her husband and her 2 preschool children, which describes her lightning quick trip down here and quick trip back tomorrow. But I was a little worried about the weather this morning, but there was some snow and rain. But Nikki assures me that as soon as she crossed the border into Iowa, it was sunshine and blue skies. So we're glad to give her an Iowa welcome. This afternoon, she offered a seminar to students, doing what you can with what you have, using your major to serve the world's poor. I'm delighted to present to you Nikki Toyama Szeto.
Hello. I want to show you a picture of Jesus. This is the picture that I walk past, hanging from 10 or 15 storefronts on Mission Street. I used to walk past this each morning on the way to the bus when I lived in San Francisco. This is Jesus of the Sacred Heart. And to be honest, I had a hard time relating to this Jesus. This genderless, raceless, possibly Caucasian Jesus. I'm not sure. But this to me feels like the Goldilocks Jesus, a little, like what I would sort of imagine Goldilocks look like. A kind of blonde for a Jewish guy. I look at this Jesus and I ask, Jesus, do you know what it's like to be me? Do you know what it's like to be an Asian American woman? Specifically an Asian American woman in America now? And if you do you want to change any of the commands that you have in your Bible? Or do they stand just as they are, also for me? Asking these questions felt taboo, felt like skipping stones in glass homes, felt dangerous. Moving beyond a plump, fed on mac and cheese Jesus, I asked him, do you know what it's like to be a Japanese American post-World War II? Do you know what it's like to be an Asian woman with all the images that the media has about what we're supposed to be like? Do you have any changes regarding the commands that you have in your Bible? Does the command to leave family and fields for the sake of the gospel, does that refer to Asian families too? Does the suggestion to serve and take the lowest spot apply when it seems that we often start off in the lowest spot or maybe no spot at the table at all? My experience in America has been one of invisibility and of voicelessness. Few political candidates seek my vote. I know here in Iowa that must just seem like totally foreign. But few political candidates seek my vote. We're just not a powerful enough voting bloc to be noticed. The model minority myth has led others to believe that I'm doing just fine and that the system is not broken. I see images of Asian Pacific Islander women on TV, and I don't know whether or not I should picture myself as a newscaster or the Dragon Lady villain that I see on TV. But isn't there more options for Asian women than newscaster or the Dragon Lady villain? I don't know if Linsanity is sweeping Iowa, as it is in other parts of the country, and I'm also hearing in Canada. If it's not, Jeremy Lin is a Harvard Asian American NBA player, and he's doing really well for the New York Knicks. Spike Lee was wearing his jersey the other day, and there's a lot of conversation going on about Asian American male masculinity, because basketball players are kind of the epitome of masculinity, and Asian men are usually not associated with that picture. So that's kind of sweeping the land. My husband's from Harvard, and I'm telling him that the news story is that despite the fact that he went to a school with such a crummy basketball program, he's actually in the NBA. That's what I think is the true kind of amazingness of the story. So I asked Jesus, I said, Jesus, do you know what it's like to be a Japanese American woman? And if so, do you have anything that you'd like to change with what you're asking? Life did not give me the luxury of ignoring what my gender or what my race was. I wish sometimes that I could escape my gender or my race, or have some days where I just don't know. But life did not give me the luxury of being able to ignore what my gender or what my race is. As I travel the world, I always take me with me. There's no getting away from me, from my Asian face. And whether or not I think of myself as Asian, everybody interacts with me as a woman of Asian descent. For most people, that's the first thing about me that they see. And I have no idea what that means to each one of them. I traveled overseas, and it was in the context of interacting with other cultures that racial and gender dynamics just popped into contrast. The political correctness environment in the United States doesn't really allow for people to make a lot of mistakes or to say kind of dumb things. But my work with college students took me to a variety of different cities around the world. I took a group of students on a poverty immersion into the slums of Nairobi, Kenya, into the garbage villages of Cairo, and into the red light districts and slums of Bangkok. And in each of those three places, I learned something else about race or about gender or both. In Kenya, I learned that Asian is treated very differently than black and white. The racial and power stratification of the country showed me that race still did matter. The legacy of British colonialization left a strong power dynamic along racial lines. And in Cairo, I felt what it was like to be in a society where men and women had really strict rules. My friendly, hello, did not go over very well with the men in the Cairo tea shops. They didn't quite know what to do with me. And in Bangkok, both my race and my gender, they combined. I saw the exploitation of Asian women packaged up into a commodity for visitors of every country. There were red light districts for German tourists, for Japanese tourists, for American tourists. Asian women made available for any group of tourists that decided to come to Bangkok. Thai women entertained men from all these different countries in all these different bars and nightclubs. Everywhere, women were for sale to the highest bidder, and sometimes for not very much money at all. I discovered how my gender and my race affected so many areas of my life, how people treat me, what they perceive about me, the space that they make for me, what they perceive of my role, my communication, and ultimately my faith. I learned to recognize the cultural pushes and pulls of my life. And at the same time, I began to see the ways that culture entered into the Bible in places that I did not even expect. The picture painted in Revelation 7:9 talks about a great multitude that no one could count from every nation. A great multitude that no one could count from every nation. How did John, the writer of Revelation, know that there were people there from every single nation? Did they carry signs like they do in the Olympics? Albania, yay! Azerbaijan, yay! And the two people walking with pride with their sign. Is that how John knew that they came from every different nation? No, I believe that John knew they came from every different nation because they carried artifacts from their culture in that great picture we see in Revelations. They still had artifacts from their culture there in the very throne room of Christ. Revelations 21 talks about how the kings of the earth give gifts to God from their countries. And it made me think, why don't I want to bring gifts from my culture to God? Why don't I ever think of bringing gifts from my culture to God? And that's when I realized I was embarrassed. Western imperialism of Christianity was so deep in me, I didn't even know it. Why did I hate my culture? Why did I not want to bring those gifts to God or think that he would be interested in receiving them as gifts? I did not think that they were good gifts that would be interesting to the Western God that I served. And then I began to look at how society looked at my culture, and I began to see how my ethnic identity was a liability. Things that marked me as ridiculous, invisible, or of no worth. I'm a child of the 70s, but I grew up in the 80s. I grew up in the culture of the 80s. You may have noticed my leg warmers and my cut-off sweatshirt or my lace gloves. Maybe those give me away as a child of the 80s. One of the movies that we watched as a kid was 16 Candles. And in 16 Candles is a character, Long Duck Dong. He's a student of Asian descent. And throughout the whole entire movie, he's a big joke. He's socially awkward. He speaks with a thick accent. He's clueless and ridiculous. I was embarrassed as I watched the movie with my Caucasian friends. And after the movie ended, I made a point to talk very distinctly without an accent afterwards because I wanted no connection to that Long Duck Dong character. I tried to distance myself from him as much as I could. I'm an Audrey Hepburn fan. I love old movies, but I can't watch Breakfast at Tiffany's. Mickey Rooney's character is a Japanese landlord, a caricature of Japanese descent. He's buck-toothed, he's ridiculous, he's clumsy and awkward, he hits his head on the lamp, he falls around, he's desperate in his desire, and entirely ridiculous. The character Holly Golightly, she treats him as a child. And that's the media's portrayal of what Japanese folks look like. These are the pictures of my culture that I saw around me. Do you know what beloit is? You may have seen it on the show Fear Factor. Beloit is a Filipino delicacy. Here in America, we eat eggs that are raw or cooked, but they're unfertilized. But this Filipino delicacy called beloit, it's actually a fertilized egg. And so a fertilized egg means that, baby chicken has begun to grow in the egg. So when you eat it, there's a little bit of a crunch. It's a very interesting experience. But the thing is, Fear Factors and other shows have used this to basically gross out contestants and to see if they're willing to do it for how much money, how fast they can do this really, really gross thing. But balut is a Filipino delicacy. It's a thing that somebody might give as an act of honor for a guest who is coming to visit their home. And on American television, it's used as a dare of something so terrible, we dare you to eat it. After these portrayals of Asian culture, I'm embarrassed to bring the cultural artifacts from my community to God. Would he even receive them as gifts, or would he be grossed out by the things that I bring? In my head, the Christian God was a Western God. But let me say, Jesus loves balut. He loves natto and kimchi jjigae. God loves durian and bitter melon and every stinky fruit that Southeast Asia can create. God is not a Western God. The first church of the New Testament is actually in Asia. Its first poetry is Asian, but Western culture has captured Jesus. The picture I had at the end times was of a Jesus, a white Jesus, who, if there was balut being offered to him from the kings of the different countries, would say, "Ooh, that's gross." But in order to get over my Western perspective of who Jesus is, I picture a Jesus who sees balut and says, "Oh, I love this. This is my favorite." He sees it, he knows what it is, and he savors it. He doesn't respond the way that Caucasian people respond to my life and to my home foods. I picture this banquet at the end time, and in my head I used to picture just pizza, casseroles, and hamburgers. And this is true, there'll be pizza, hamburgers, and casseroles there. But that's not all. In Acts 17, it talks about a God who created the boundaries and the times and the places for all people so that they would know God and find him. He set these times and these places. He's not far from any one of us. That's Acts 17. I had thought that my culture would make me farther from God, but actually, that banquet table at the end times is going to have pizza, casseroles, hamburgers, balut, sukiyaki, and kimchi jjigae. I realized that I had this perception that certain cultures are closer to God and other cultures are farther, and I would have put myself in a culture that was farther from God. But Acts 17 reiterates that God created all the cultures, set their times, their boundaries, and their lands, and he is near to every single one of them. Not closer to some and farther to others, but that he is near to each one. Jesus was Jewish. He came to a Middle Eastern culture. Why do I picture him as Caucasian? There are some things that make it easy for me to see God, but I only saw the things that made it much more difficult. The things that made God feel far away and foreign to me. I had a Western understanding of God, but the reality is he's not far from any one of us. I began to see that there are some things that I understand about God because of my culture that make me not far from God. There are ways that my Asian culture is close to the Jewish culture in which Jesus lived. But I only saw the things that made me far away from God because I had a Western understanding of God, and that encouraged me to delve deeper into my Asian culture. As I went deeper into my culture, I began to understand and discover some of the aspects about Asian culture that reveals God to me. And the truth, he is not far from any one of us, became true for me. Let me give you an example. Acts 2 paints a picture of a community. Some of the things that describe this community are they're a community that held everything in common. In that community, there were people, there was no one who had any wants. It was a community that was an economic community, that they shared all of their possessions among each other. And I read that passage, and you know what? That picture is very familiar to me. I live in that picture every day through my family. I see the truth of that scripture lived out in my family every day. In my Asian family, when someone buys a house, everybody bought that house. Everyone pitches in, everyone sends in money for the down payment, but that also means, as a result, everyone is welcome to come stay at that house whenever they want. Sometimes for months at a time. There's no questions about, is this a convenient time to come? I've never heard that question from my family. They're just like, we're coming. 2 months, is that fine? Clean the room. You know, I mean, it's just an announcement. There's this posture of everyone just owns that house. People just show up. It's everyone's house. Or I see that lived out. I see Acts 2 lived out. When the youngest brother goes off to medical school. When he went off to medical school, everyone who was working sent money to him every month. Anyone who had a job in our family sent money to him every month. Why? Because he was a student and he was working. And the folks who have money and who had a job, they were the ones who sent money to him every month so that he would not be in need. Because he's a student and we're working, we sent it to him. There is no bill at the end. There's no keeping track of what is owed or payments back in installments. There's no independence at 18. In our American context and our independent culture, kids are charged for rent by their parents. Contracts are written, tallies are kept, but it's a foreign concept in Asian culture. He is sent off with money. There's no bill at the end. And that, to me, is living out of Acts 2, the Acts 2 community, sharing all things in common that the Bible talks about. Because of the way I grew up, this Acts 2 picture is very familiar, and I understand it. In fact, I would challenge the values of independence and entrepreneurship that mark American Christianity in our context. I sometimes think that independence and entrepreneurship are more American than they are biblical. Luke 10 talks about people who are sent out in pairs. They're taught about dependency upon God in the midst of mission. They're not taught about great insurance plans or retirement plans, but they are taught dependency on God and interdependency on others and those they serve. I can't think of a single biblical story that exhorts us to independence. So I begin to discover all of the beautiful ways that my culture opens up my understanding of God and his truths as revealed in the Bible. At the same time, the more I learn about the culture, the more I realize that I need God. I read the book, The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. And as much as I was discovering the fantastic things about my Japanese cultures and all the things that I love, I realized I can't just pick and choose the good things and totally ignore the bad things. That as I look at my culture, I need to look with both eyes fully open. And The Rape of Nanking opened my eyes more than I wanted to see. Because there, Iris Chang outlined the atrocities of war that the Japanese soldiers committed against Nanking, this region in South China, against men and women and children. I learned about comfort women and the exploitation of Korean women for the Japanese army. And it was in that moment that I began to realize that my culture, left to its own devices, is a very dangerous thing. We have issues with cultural superiority and prejudice that blind us from seeing the value of other people and other groups of people. Japanese culture is not king. It opened up some aspects so that I could understand God, but it was also a very dangerous culture as well. I became sensitive to the tension between when my culture helps me understand God and when my culture needs to be redeemed by God. I met a woman, her name is Nicole. She's a paraplegic missionary in China. Actually she's a Canadian woman, missionary in China. And you know, the thing about her that I think is absolutely extraordinary is that in Chinese culture, there is not a great category for paraplegics. In general, physical defaults and deformities are seen as liabilities. Folks are shunned out of families and not really talked about. But there is Nicole, this bold Canadian woman, a paraplegic, who is modeling out dependency on God in ways that are just beyond words. She lives it with her everyday life. And there's something, I think, extraordinary about her being present in China and being out in the open with her physical challenges that is really prophetic to the Chinese culture and their view of folks who are differently abled. That's where I realized that while I want to explore the ways that I understand God because of my culture, I can't look only to my culture to understand God, because there are some things that are very wrong with my culture as well. No one culture can capture all of who God is. Instead, God imparted pieces of himself into many cultures. And so for those of Christian faith, there's a mandate to know and understand these differences. What are the aspects of each culture that help me understand and have a more full picture of who God is, as revealed in the Bible? For me and my Japanese American heritage, I know about a God who provides in the context of community. So I look to other cultures to show me and tell me other things about God that I just don't have access to, that I just don't understand. From African Americans, we have a great heritage of spirituals. And their spirituals tell us about a God who knows how to stand with those who are long-suffering, a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, and a God who works through social systems to bring freedom. From Latino Christians, we learn about a God of the landless, the God of the wanderer, the God of people on a move. From First Nations Christians, we learn about God, the Creator. From a business sense, it just makes sense to pursue diverse teams. Studies show that diverse teams come up with more robust and creative solutions to problems. But for Christians, it needs to go beyond that. Pursuing multi-ethnicity is a matter for our very souls. It's not just an optional thing, but it's a matter for our souls. For we are far too tempted to make God in our own image, of shifting God to support and bend to our own values. Making God in our own image has another name, and that's idolatry. But we need people with diverse perspectives and diverse backgrounds to study Scripture with us in order to comment on the cultural assumptions that we carry with us into our religious practice, the ways that we overlay our culture and impose that on who God is. But in truth-telling communities, we come to a picture that is more biblical and more full, a fuller picture of God. The world says, don't be racist. I have a toddler, and my poor children. My husband and I, we had our kids when we were older. And so the poor things are now suffering. I know Asian people look very young, but I'm at the back end of my 30s. And my husband and I, we had our kids when we were older. And so the poor things are now suffering because we are overeducated parents. My children are being raised by overeducated parents. There's actually a syndrome. I don't know if you know this syndrome. It's called the overeducated parent syndrome. It's predominant in university towns, maybe like this one. It's when people have too much time on their hands and read too much, and they read too much about raising their children, that their knowledge actually ends up thwarting their children's growth. Here's a great example, I think, of an overeducated parent syndrome. This is a totally true story. One of my friends is an MD, PhD. And he had heard that early exposure to languages is a good thing for the child's brain development. He had read that kids who are exposed to language early will later learn to speak that language without an accent. So he thought if one language is good, 2 is even better. And if 2 is good, then I'm going to do 5. So he bought 5 different language tapes, and he was very strategic about it. He bought French, German, Japanese, Swahili, and something else, African click or something like that. He tried to choose something from every language group so that his kid would get a diversity of listening. They would drive around in their car and they would pop in one tape. And when that was done, they would pop in the next tape and just keep cycling through all of these different languages. Do you know what happened? His child didn't start speaking until he was 5. No joke. Because I think he's like, is that an apple or a manzana? I don't know. It's a different word every time I see it. He had a very sophisticated sign language system, however, so he was able to communicate, but he actually didn't speak his first words until well into his 5th year. That is the curse of the overeducated parent, when sometimes too much knowledge is dangerous. Anyways, so I was listening to this program that was talking about how to raise your child in this multicultural reality. And here I am, an overeducated parent, and so this program was talking about how to talk about race with your kids, so I turn up the volume and I'm listening. You know, fancy programs, educated kids, it's terrible. So after weeks of, this study was so interesting, after weeks of listening to parents talking about race with their children, the kids in the final evaluation were, evaluated on, did you understand what your parents were talking about? So, their parents would say, all people are created equal, all people are created equal, and, all sorts of mantras that are very good and universal. And the kids would say, at the very end, after weeks of being in this program, the kids finally said, what is equal? totally miss this concept. They're talking about race in these really like conceptual terms. And these kids like totally, they totally missed it. We have pretty words, but if you want the truth, I don't think we know what it means to talk about race. We've got these great ideas. All people are created equal. But what in the world does that mean? As Christians, can we move to a different place? It's not that we live in a colorblind world and that all people are created equal. Actually, not all people are created equal. Some people are more likely to get a taxi than other person late at night in New York City. We do not all get taxis equally. Some people are more likely to be given the tag model minority and seen as harmless based on the color of their skin and the shape of their eyes. Some babies will be adopted more quickly than others because of the color of their skin. And some people will be given harder prison sentences just because of the color of their skin. It's naive to say that all people are created equal, but where is the truth of the gospel, and can it be robust enough to encounter that reality? I used to run a race when I lived in the Quad Cities of Iowa. I worked for a short time for John Deere. And this race in the Quad Cities of Iowa, every year, the winner was Kenyan. And not only was the winner Kenyan was Kenyan from a specific tribe in Kenya. That tribe dominated that race, year after year after year. Not everyone is created equally. People are created differently, but as Christians, we believe that all people are created in the image of God. Some people are created with huge advantages in life and love and business and sports because of the amount of pigmentation in their skin or their genetic heritage. But whether that matches the same as the people, or whether that matches the same as the people who are in power in a country at a given time. But for Christians, here is what is true. We are each image bearers in Christ. And not one of us, not one person, not one race, not one nation can fully reflect all the creativity, the splendor, the nuance, and the majesty of God. It takes us all, each reflecting a portion, to get towards a fuller picture of God. And we do not disqualify people, as the world does, from being full contributors based on their race, their education, the amount of money that they have, or whatever else. We're like those pictures at those huge sporting events where you're sitting on a card in a stadium, and at one point everyone puts the card up over their head, and then the camera pans, and then there's this huge picture of a Hawkeye, right? The whole stadium created this massive picture, but everyone had just a portion. That's what we're like, but instead of a stadium, we're standing in a line that stretches to eternity of groups of people who know something about God that I don't know, and it takes many to fully reflect who God is. Not everyone is created equal, but everyone has equal value. Why? Because we are all image bearers of God, and all of us are needed to have a fuller picture of God. Otherwise, we risk using God to support our own agendas and making God in our own image, and that's called idolatry. It's also at the heart of some of the worst movements that were perpetuated in God's name. I helped write a book called More Than Serving Tea, and it looks at the intersection between race and gender and faith for Asian American women. The book came about because as I was working on campus at Stanford and UC Berkeley and University of San Francisco, I began to notice that the Asian American women in my community kept dealing with the same discipleship issues. The same things came up: perfectionism, expectations of parents, a fear of leadership, a feeling of voicelessness, a sense of invisibility. And these themes kept coming up, and as I talked to people who were working with other young women, Asian American women across the country, regardless of the geographic location, these same themes kept coming up, dealing with issues of perfectionism, of expectations, relationship with parents, sexuality, voice, voicelessness, and invisibility. And as we began to delve deeper into why is it that certain issues keep coming up for these Asian American Christian women, one of the things that we looked at that was really fascinating was that this picture of what an Asian American woman should be froze in time at the moment that a family immigrated from Asia into America. That the role of a woman froze in time at that point. So a Japanese American family that immigrated in the 1950s would have a picture of a woman from the 1950s as part of their model of what a Japanese American woman should look like. And now in Japan, that model doesn't still exist. It's been evolving in that society. But in America, it froze in time in order to kind of protect the cultural influence, protect it from American cultural influence. And so we had these women who were growing up in the 90s who were being compared to a gender idolization that was based in the 1950s or the 70s, whenever their families came over from immigration. They were frozen in time. And the more they deviated from that picture, the less Asian they felt. And then they began to wonder, am I really Asian? And then you overlay with that some Christian expectations about purity or about what the Christian life looks like lived out, and became a toxic combination for these women. So we wrote the book in order that women would see where some of the expectations that they were living under were actually laid on by their culture and not actually a part of the discipleship and invitation that Jesus invites them into. We were trying to separate out biblical truth from a cultural overlay. I want to share with you a couple of pictures of Jesus. This first picture, and we'll show it up here on the slide, is a picture of Mary with a baby Jesus. Now, I know that we're not supposed to make God in our own image. But I want to show these two images to you, this picture and another one, because the point is that by seeing Jesus portrayed in a very distinctly East Asian way, I hope that it reveals some of the cultural assumptions that we didn't realize were inherent in the other pictures of Jesus that we have. Here we see a baby Jesus with a mother. You'll notice how small this baby Jesus looks, different from some of the Western pictures of baby Jesus, who looks big, or even like the Pietà, where the grown Jesus is superhumanly large. But here we have a very small baby Jesus. It speaks to me something about the vulnerability of that baby. In the next picture, we have a picture of Jesus praying. But he's praying in a position that's uniquely Eastern. And there's something to me that opens up a door. I didn't realize that the other places where I've seen Jesus praying, kneeling on his knees with his hand folded, are actually very Western postures of prayer. But here, looking at a very distinctly Eastern posture of prayer, it challenges me to think, what are the preconceived notions I have about what Jesus looks like and what he does? Here, it's obviously not his culture, but it points me back to some of the assumptions that I didn't even know that I made about the Jesus that I was receiving through Western culture. I'm not saying that this is what Jesus looked like. He's obviously not Japanese, he's Jewish. But what I found is that these cultural pictures really poke at some of the assumptions in the cultural overlay. I don't think I realized how heavily cultural some of the images that we have of Jesus are, and the theology that it tries to communicate. In this process, I've discovered that my gender and my ethnicity are God's best gift to me. They're not things that I need to overcome in order to understand God better. But rather, our God is a God who created all peoples, the times and the places and the boundaries of their land, and this is quoting Acts 17, so that they would know him and seek him and find him, and he is not far from any one of us. I hope that, like me, you will discover that your gender, your race, and your ethnicity are God's best gift to you, that there is something that you are able to see uniquely about God that I need to understand and learn from, so that I too can have a fuller picture of God. So I hope that we all receive our gender and our ethnicity as one of God's best gifts for us on the journey. Thank you.
I was interested in your thoughts about not all are equal, but we're all equal before God. And I teach a class on social determinants, so we often get involved into disparity discussions. And I agree that greed is something that Christians should not facilitate and try to change. But I've been thinking more lately that so much of the disparity discussion assumes that because our socioeconomic status is different, that those in the lower statuses are worse victims, and that true light and wonderful heaven will come if we could do away with these different socioeconomic positions.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that that isn't maybe the whole story for Christians. So I wonder what you would think about that.
Yeah, I think in the American context, I'm going to call it poverty, is an economic term. And so what you're talking about, kind of the lower socioeconomic and how that is not a state to be desired, but just to elevate everyone up to a higher socioeconomic would sort of solve all these problems. I spent in the same summer time, and I had sort of referred to this, of in Nairobi, Kenya, Kibera slum in Nairobi, Kenya, in the garbage village of Cairo, and then in Bangkok. And the per person average monthly income is $30 in Kibera, $60 in Cairo, and $120 in Bangkok. And one of the things that was very striking to me was the quality of life in each of those places. And that's what broke me of the definition that poverty is only an economic state, but rather that there are also other factors that need to be addressed. So I would say the quality of life of the women in the red light district in Bangkok was worse than the quality of life of the folks that we work with in the Kibera slum, even though the folks in the Kibera slum had made a quarter of what the folks made in the Thai brothels. And that's when I began to realize that there is something about poverty that has a spiritual component, a social component, an emotional component, and a physical component, in addition to being an economic component. But I think in some of the readings that I've done as well, people have talked about how in the American context, in the Western context, we just associate poverty with lack of money, and therefore the solution is the increase of income for different folks. And I think you're exactly right that that's to oversimplify the situation.
Just wondering, when this kid finally started talking at age 5, how many languages did he know?
I don't know. I was shocked. It was really funny because like when a train would go by, he had this very sophisticated like, train go by. I was scared. I was like, wow, he just did a whole sentence in a made up sign language kind of a thing. I was like, does he speak? And he's like, and at that point he was about 4.5. And then so I found out later from his parents that he did start speaking at age 5. I don't know a lot of detail, but that scared me straight as a parent.
Nikki, you're with InterVarsity and you're well-traveled. Just wondering, how do you approach somebody in a culture foreign from your own, say in India or the Middle East or Africa, with the gospel? How do you start explaining salvation?
I think it depends on each of the different communities. But the thing that I do believe is that the gospel is good news for people. And the thing that I try to discover is where are some of the common grounds that we do agree on, and to start from there, as well as where are there places where there are live questions about the good news that God is, or where there are places in people's lives that they need good news. So one example would be, and actually this is not something that I created myself, but it was something that I had learned from someone who works with Muslim communities. But it's something that I have used as an entree point for folks from a Muslim background, is in finding out that they're Muslim, I said, oh, my family is also people of the word. We are also people of the book. There's a beautiful prayer in your book. Would you recite that for me? And it talks about some of the truths that I think Christians can also agree on, that God is, that there is no God but God. So I think finding some places of commonality. As I worked with women in the red light district, one of the things that was amazing is in the Buddhist context there isn't quite the same concept of forgiveness. And so one of the things is we had some middle-class Thai women along with us as we were doing outreach in the red light district. And one of the things that we were talking about was from our Christian standpoint, it's people who need God the most that he is most close to or most easily accessible to. And that for her was a foreign concept from her Buddhist spirituality. And she looked at me, she goes, you know, that makes a lot of sense, that the people who would need it most, God is closest to, the people who are in some ways weakest. So that was, I think, finding some places where they are experiencing God's truth and just interpreting it in the cultural context. But if you want the truth, it's mostly about relationships and journeying with people, and when God shows up, just saying, hey, God showed up. I think he wants your attention.
Nikki, you have been a consultant to Christian groups, kind of looking at literature and so on, and how Asians or Asian Americans are portrayed. You mentioned the movies and the wider culture and so on, but I wonder if you have found things any different or any better in the church, and maybe you could give us some examples of some of the stereotypes or some of the things that you have noticed in that kind of work.
I've been involved in a couple of conversations with Christian publishing houses that have been very challenging. One of them had to do with a denomination who created a vacation Bible school curriculum called Journey to the Sun, and the children were encouraged to make coolie hats and put those on, and fortune cookies. It was just a mishmash of Japanese, Chinese, and other Asian cultures. It was a whole vacation Bible school curriculum that was rolled out to a whole entire denomination. That was a really hard conversation, to be a part of a group of Asian American folks who were bringing attention to that. And I'd say the interactions with that denomination were very hard. We tried to just challenge them to pull the material. On the flip side, there was another organization, and I'll name them because they had a tremendous response, Youth Specialties. They had published a set of plays that were supposed to be used for youth group. And in the plays, there was a Chinese delivery boy character. This is plays that were written for youth group, and my heart broke. It was basically a Long Duck Dong character, but like it was published, 5 years ago. And my heart broke for the one Chinese student in that youth group who would be sitting there and watching that play unfolding in his church, right? The one place where he's supposed to feel accepted, even if he didn't feel accepted in his school. Now, when we brought that up with the writers, they listened so well. And we asked them to, can you please pull the material? They said, we're going to go one step further. They said, we are so sorry. We see what we did was wrong. We have wronged the Asian Christian community. We're pulling that. We're destroying every copy that's in storage, and we're just cutting that out entirely. We had asked them only to just kind of stop, and they just, I feel like it was an extraordinary picture of repentance. So I think it's not about not ever making mistakes, but it's about when you're interacting with each other and how you respond to those things, and is there enough partnership and community in the gospel that you can kind of have really hard conversations. The predominant image, right, is one of family, and families are not necessarily one of harmony, but they're communities that have committed to each other for the long run. You just fight differently in your family than you do with strangers. So, I mean, that was an example of an engagement with a Christian publishing house that I thought was extraordinarily redemptive. So.
We have a thoughtful group tonight. Not a lot of questions, so this gives me a chance. We have a Friday night Bible study and home group out of our home, and during the Virginia Tech, or after the Virginia Tech shootings, at that time we had quite a few Asians in our group, and some of the feelings came out that I had never heard before about feeling that Americans are prejudiced against Asians, and Asians and Americans can't tell different Asians apart, Koreans from Chinese and Japanese and so on. And it opened my mind to what they were experiencing that I was not aware of to any extent. I wonder if from your position you can speak to how some Asians or Asian Americans feel that the majority white society views Asians. I know it's a broad generalization, but
Sure. I mean, I can give one specific example. I think this example, it doesn't necessarily feel racist, but I would say it can be received as racist. And it's the question of, where are you from? I get that question all the time. Where are you from? If I say Chicago, no, where are you really from? I go, okay, 4 generations back, I'm from Japan. I used to get that question growing up in Chicago. People would say, oh, where are you really from? Japan. My friend Magda Stolarski, she was truly a Polish immigrant. She wasn't born in America. People would ask, where are you from? She'd say, Chicago. No one would ask another thing. So I think this perception of the Asian as the perpetual foreigner, no matter how long we've been here, we actually don't belong. That's actually the form of racism that a lot of Asians experience on a day-to-day basis. And what that does is it makes you feel outside of social systems, political systems, economic systems. It just makes you feel constantly like an outsider. So then you get these incidents like the Virginia Tech shooting, and you kind of go, wow, what was going on for that man? And I think a lot of Asians were like, that could totally have been me. So I just think there's an extraordinary amount of identification with that. I think one of the things that's been interesting is there was a movie that came out called Better Luck Tomorrow. It was about a story, it was based on a true story that happened in Southern California of 4 high-achieving young Asian men and how they were complicit in the murder of a student and kind of covered it up. And watching that movie and the dynamics that were going on, I was surprised at the power of emotion that came out specific from Asian men as they watched that movie. I just think there was some visceral truth that was tapped into that movie was kind of calling out. So I think that there's a lot going on. And it would be a gift to the broader community if we could learn how to talk about it and be good friends to each other.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Tony.
The question I have is, what would you say are the characteristics of a healthy multi-ethnic community?
I think one of the so the question was about characteristics of a healthy multi-ethnic community, and I think one of the strongest characteristics or indicators of health would be the ability to fight well and cleanly. So just the ability to have a category for how to make mistakes, talk about it in a way that's transformative and brings health to the community. I would say that's probably the #1 characteristic of a healthy multi-ethnic community. Another characteristic? I would say it would be a place where everyone feels like their voice and their contribution is affirmed and there's space for it. So that there doesn't feel like a hierarchy of certain kinds of people become leaders, certain kinds of activities are rewarded, certain kinds of contributions are more valued highly than others. So there's an appreciation for a diversity of leadership styles, an appreciation for a diversity of prayer styles, a diversity of appreciation that all of these different things actually bring an aspect that's really helpful to each of those areas. So I would say a lot of space for lots of different kinds of voices would be another one. When you find it, let me know. I think we're all on a journey of trying to find healthy multi-ethnic communities.
I'm wondering if you can give us some practical examples of how this works out at Urbana, for instance. Mm-hmm. I mean, your program director, you say, okay, we're starting at 7 o'clock. At 7 o'clock Western time, not African time, or whatever. You know, what are some of the issues, and how do you deal with it when you get such a multi-ethnic group together?
Yeah, that's a great question. The conference as we know it, is a very Western concept, and so with that, I have inherited just a behemoth of a legacy of a thing, of a form that I can't change. I sometimes wish that we could do this Nigerian style where we would have a big tent and whoever shows up and people would camp out in the field next to it. That would simplify a lot of things. But we do this in the Edward Jones Dome. There's about 20,000 folks. If my program runs 1 minute over, that costs $10,000 in overtime for the buses that are idling. So we are an American conference. period. It's very strongly American, very strongly North American and Western conference for sure. So I think one of the things that it's really hard to do is to cultivate. We try to give preference and have our speakers come from the majority world. I take stewardship of the Urbana platform very, very seriously. And I try to give that space to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to speak to a North American audience. They haven't written a book that's a bestseller. They don't have a mega church that's behind them putting all of their sermons online. I take very carefully the stewardship of what are the stories that we really should be hearing, but maybe there aren't the economics to make that voice rise to the top. So one of the things that's really challenging is our venue is very intimidating for some of our majority world speakers, and how to give them the sense of space, for them to speak how they speak, to give a prophetic word, to maybe say some pretty hard things for a North American audience, and tell them that's actually what we want them to bring, is the hard thing, the stuff that we ourselves don't know is going on. So I think the development of the content is a very partnership-oriented thing. It happens over 18 months. And I would say it's really hard to work and create some space for that. One of the other places that it plays out is in our worship. I think Urbana has one of the more authentically multicultural worship spaces among churches and large conferences. And one of the things that we've discovered, we've just been on a journey of over 15 years, really trying to understand what is multi-ethnic worship, what are the different ways that different styles bring us into different places of worship of God. And we've learned that worship is not just about the songs that you sing, but it's also about the leadership and how the leadership leads. Is your leader a very directive leader? I want you to pray now, or is it a very invitational leader? Would you consider joining me in this next song? It's the spaces in between the songs and the act of hospitality around a worship set that all of those culture plays into, and there's all of those are really great for different moments in a program. So I think helping to train and interpret what it is that we're doing, so folks don't think, oh, this is just a PC thing, but no, ask the question, how are you experiencing God differently because of this cultural worship set? Or what are these songs opening up for you that's different or challenging? So it's an excellent question. It's a really hard thing. I would say we lean in the direction of trying to do that in almost every area, but knowing that the form of it, a conference at a hotel in a convention center is pretty unique to the Western world. So.
Hi. I was wondering how you came to embrace Christianity, since I know there are a lot of Christians in Japan, but the vast majority are Buddhist or Shinto. Were your parents and grandparents Christian, or did you just come to this yourself?
Yeah, my parents are both Christian. My mom came to America when she was 12, and the way she came to know Jesus was because a family, a Japanese-American family, Christian family, in Los Angeles received their family, in the same way that folks kind of have sponsored over families that are trying to start a new life in the United States. And it was through the very practical expressions of God's love that my mother and her family became Christians. My dad was raised sort of Christian, but I would say it was only in his adult life that he became kind of a stronger Christian. So I was raised in a Christian home. My church is a little bit interesting. It's a Japanese-American church in Chicago. It's one of three. And you might think, why is there a Japanese-American church in Chicago? It actually was birthed out of the internment camps. So this was, it was folks who were interned. They started a Christian church in the camp. And then these are all of the people who were not allowed to return to the West Coast, then continued on to Chicago. And so the heritage of my Japanese-American church is actually a church birthed out of the internment camps. So that racial history point is deeply intertwined with my spirituality. I never discovered that because Japanese people never talk about bad things. So I never discovered that until a book came out with the history of it, about 5 years ago. I'd been at that church for a good 30 years before that. So.
I'd like to make a special invitation to any of our people of Asian descent who would like to make a comment or ask a question. Not to put you on the spot, but I have already. But if any of you, okay, thank you.
Hey Nick, thank you for your thoughts. Just recently, with the whole, the man of the moment, Jeremy Lin, there was an article in ESPN. The headline was, after their first loss was a chink in the armor. And initially, like my personal opinion is, before Jeremy, if anyone had put something offensive like that towards Asians, they wouldn't have gotten fired. But this time, automatically ESPN fired him. And there's just been a whole bunch of other insensitive comments towards him. And like my own personal analysis is that I feel like since Jeremy's broken so many stereotypes, like he kind of represents a threat. It's everything that's been portrayed about Asians, like some black athletes have said it's because he's Asian, and then some Caucasians have made some racist comments. It's like all these stereotypes have been broken, and like whether or not you think like it's like a subconscious or like some threat that like, wow, this guy actually broke all these stereotypes. How can it be possible? I just want to know your thoughts on that.
You brought up some really great points. So I just wanted to kind of affirm and underline, I think there's another article that's called Why Jeremy Lin is Important. And it talks about some of what you're talking about, of what does he stand for, and all these kinds of things. I think one of the things that is interesting to me, did you say that did they fire that writer?
Oh yeah, he got fired.
He did get fired. I think one of the things that it shows me is, even though we think of ourselves as like even a post-racial society, that actually in the public sphere we actually haven't talked about race very much, such that mistakes like that have not been flushed out. I think that kind of a comment against other racial groups, we've had that discussion. People know not to say those sort of things in print anymore, but the Asian conversation is actually still so new, even though we've had Chinese folks in this country for hundreds of years. So I think it talks a little bit about the voicelessness or the marginalization of the Asian experience in the US, even though we've been here for so long. But I think it's really interesting how Jeremy Lin is coming to the forefront, and we're starting to make some mistakes, but a lot of these assumptions are actually starting to unearth. My hope is that that we will learn how to disagree and learn and make mistakes in a civil way. I would say another area is that in the area of gender. I think the last presidential election showed, there are some mistakes people make in how they talk about gender. Like, we may not be quite as far along on some of these conversations as we think we are, because we're so polite, but it takes some of these things. So.
It's like what you were just talking about earlier, the double standard. Like if someone would have said, like, the N-word or like the F-word towards homosexuals, like automatically there'd been a huge like visceral reaction. But before Jeremy towards Asians, like, why do you think the double standard existed? And
I think it's this model minority myth. People have said things, there's this perception that Asian Americans are quiet. We must not be saying anything bad if they're not saying anything about it. So I would say also too, though, it points to a lack of access to some of the places where these conversations are happening. There aren't Asian Americans at the table kind of saying like, hey, I don't think so. So I think one of the more strategic places I'm hoping both Asian Americans and Christians go into is the world of publishing. I just think our culture does not say, lawyer, engineer, doctor. It's like writer, publisher. Like, those are really influential places for our society and culture. But great question. If people are not familiar, Jeremy Lin is a really interesting case study in terms of what's going on now with Asian American masculinity. So a quick Google search on him. There's a couple of thoughtfully written articles about this, and even if you read the ones that aren't very thoughtful, you'll probably learn something about that too. So.
I was wondering, since there are so many ethnic East Asians in California and in Vancouver, but we hardly ever see them like on TVs or movies made in California, even though they've been around for a long time. Is that because it's just considered making a spectacle of yourself, or is it because in the United States, Hollywood is mostly, entertainment is mostly seen by some career for people who are not going to be able to make it on their own academically, and so it's kind of like a roll of the dice for people who are willing to, because they have nothing to lose, or?
I think there's a lot of power that goes into the people who greenlight movies and what kind of movies they think movie-going audiences will buy tickets for. So a really interesting example is the Harold and Kumar franchise. I don't know if I would highly recommend going, but I will let you know that when the first Harold and Kumar movie came out, the reason I don't know if I'd recommend it broadly is because it's stoner, the genre is stoner movies. But one of the things that I did when the Harold and Kumar movie came out is I went to the box office and I bought a ticket on the opening weekend because there was a huge question in the Hollywood community about whether people would see a movie that was being led by two Asian men. So I think it's, even though a lot of Asians live in California or where these movies are made, I think there's a tremendous amount of power in the people who decide what projects are going, and in a sense determine what our tastes are, what kind of comedians people will find funny, what kind of stories driven by what kind of actors are we interested in. But it really boils down to who buys which tickets. I don't think it's as much like Asian culture is keeping fantastic artists from going into the art as I think it is there actually aren't a lot of vehicles for a lot of Asians. And I think Hollywood needs to be convinced that there's actually a market of people maybe beyond Asians who are interested in movies that are being led by leading characters of Asian descent. Does that answer your question?
So you're saying that there's a normal, I'll talk loudly. So you're saying there's a typical amount of people who want to get into Hollywood, since there's not much demand from the people who make the productions.
I would think maybe so. The example I can give you, and this is not Hollywood, but this is when we published our book. Our publisher, so we knew our content was good because we just tested it among lots of Asian American women across the country, and they would read our chapter list or whatever, and they were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So we knew that our content was amazing and it was really relevant. People were very eager to see and read it. Now, the pathway between having a book proposal and then actually having and getting that book into people's hands, it had to go through our editor, who then went through a publishing committee, none of which were Asian American women. So even though we knew that we had hit our target very well, and we also knew that Asian women are a book-buying population. They don't buy one book, they buy 10, and they give it to all of their friends. So it's like a mass, so we were telling them that. We had to just trust that our editor and then the publishing committee would greenlight it, even though, like in our head, the case was fully made. They greenlighted the project, they published our book on a limited release. We were on our 8th publishing because all of these decision makers were not totally convinced. So they kind of took a risk. But as a result of taking a risk on what they were calling kind of this niche book, because it's Asian and women, like, oh, it's so specific, that publisher has actually gone ahead and begun to greenlight other niche projects because they're just surprised. So that I would say is kind of, that's where the people who are in a decision-making body or have the power to say go on projects, there may not be actually people from those parties. So it's just a really strange power dynamic. I have never felt so disempowered in a process before, or so powerless in a process. So.
I grew up in Iowa City, but I've also lived in West and East Coast briefly. So I was just knowing that you grew up in Chicago and then now living in Wisconsin and having lived in the West Coast. What are your thoughts on living as an Asian American in different places in America? I was wanting to know what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, living as an Asian American in the Midwest versus the West Coast is a totally different thing. My husband is from a city called Monterey Park, which is one of the first ethno-burbs. You can go there and drive for miles and not see any sign in English. The dim sum is fantastic. The Chinese buffets are unbelievable, but it is an ethno-burb. He went to high school in a place that was, I think, 80 or 90% Asian. That was just not my experience. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois. My high school was 48% white, 48% black, 4% other. And I was there during the Rodney King riots. So I just had a very racialized experience there. My husband and my view of power dynamics and different things like that is really, really different. So I think how you grew up, where you grew up, some of the reinforcements from your culture significantly shape. And honestly, we need all types to talk about what their experience is, because God set the times, the boundaries, and places for each people so that he would seek them, or people would seek him and would know him and find him. So no experience is more Asian than another. They are all equally valid experiences. So.
Hi, Nikki. I want to get your thoughts on how do you think the Asian American community facilitates the stereotypes? For example, in the American context, people usually think of Asians having to excel academically, whereas they're not looked at as being good sportsmen. That stereotype with the German and all of that stuff. And there's the issue of the tiger moms and all of that stuff. So to what extent do you think that the Asian American community facilitates this type of stereotype?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, I would say the Asian community does. It contributes and facilitates some of the stereotypes. I think for some of the stereotypes have been driving factors for them and have shaped people's priorities and experiences when they have just given into the stereotypes. The thing that concerns me is when Asian Americans view the model minority stereotype as a positive one wholly. Because I think the model minority stereotype has an extremely silencing effect on people, so there's a significant loss of voice, even as there is space for achievement. So it's kind of at what cost do people perpetuate some of these stereotypes? So I do think that there is some complicity in creating some of the material that perpetuates some of the stereotypes. I would also say there's also a significant market, though, for products that perpetuate the stereotypes. So I'm not totally sure if the Chinese mom's book on parenting a healthy, happy, and integrated child would have gone terribly far. So I'm not sure how much of it is both the creation of content and perpetuating, and how much of it is also the stereotypes create an appetite for certain kinds of influence from certain kinds of people.
Nikki, you have given us a wonderful gift, and we thank you very much for your presence with us and your words with us. Thank you.
Thanks.